about my next book. This is the first massive talk that I do about my new book, something that I've been working on for the last year. Now, those of you who are familiar with my work will be familiar that one of the most important things that I talk about in the Bitcoin standard and in my work in general is the fact that Bitcoin is hard money. Bitcoin is money whose supply can't be increased by authorities that can just print it out of thin air at low cost. Everybody who wants to create Bitcoin has to have the same rules for the creation of Bitcoin applied to them. Everybody solves the same proof of work calculations, so everybody's cost of producing Bitcoin is pretty much the same. So this is money that anybody can produce, and the supply of this money does not increase in a haphazard way. It increases according to a fixed way. We know exactly how much the supply is at any point in time, and we can easily predict what it's going to be in the future. So the money supply is predictable, and the money supply is fixed. Now this is really important. The money supply being fixed means that the supply cannot grow as much as the economy grows. And we've had Bitcoin operating now for 15 years, and during those 15 years we see that during this time, we see that the Bitcoin economy has grown 10,000% over the last 10 years, but the Bitcoin supply has only grown around 50% over the last 10 years. So this, for me, the fact that Bitcoin continues to grow and operate while the supply is growing at a much slower rate than the economy grows, is, for me, empirical proof that you do not need the supply of money in an economy to grow for the economy to grow. I think this is really the important point that Austrian economists are saying, which is that money, you don't need its supply to grow. The value of money can grow without the supply growing. And so all of the functions of money can be performed without us having to have inflation. So if we don't need to have inflation, well then, that seems like a big deal, because then inflation is a bad thing. So let's think then what it would mean if we lived in a world in which the money supply did not increase. And I think a great way to try to imagine that is to think about what the 20th century would have looked like if we were using a form of money whose supply does not increase, which in the 20th century would have had to be gold. It's not quite as good as Bitcoin. The supply only goes up about 1.5% to 2%, which, you know, for people who don't have Bitcoin, you know, primitive civilizations like people before Bitcoin, that's not bad. It's not quite Bitcoin. We're at 0.8% per year supply growth rate in Bitcoin right now. But 1.5 for 20th century primitive civilization is pretty good. So what would have happened in the 20th century if we had had a gold standard? That is the topic of my next book, which is going to be released in March 2025. It's called The Gold Standard. So finishing the trilogy, the Bitcoin standard, the Fiat standard, and now the gold standard. And this is a work of fiction. It's economic fiction. I know people maybe not very familiar with the idea of economic fiction. I've never heard of a book like that. But this is an economic book, but it's also a fiction book. So it's an economic book from an alternative world in which the 20th century had a gold standard. And so I'm explaining the economics of the 20th century, an economic history of the 20th century, given what would have trying to explain what would have happened if the world had been on a gold standard. So how does that happen? Well, it happens that I decided the way to do this would be to just let Fiat do its thing so that people are free of the consequences of Fiat, are aware of the consequences of Fiat, so that they then just get rid of Fiat completely. So we have a truly Fiat-free century, which is the theme of the book. And the way that I do it is thanks to this little invention, which is a company called BTC, operating in 1911, which starts operating in 1911. And the basic idea here is that a bunch of aviation entrepreneurs set up this company, a French guy called Louis Blériot. Now this guy existed in reality. He was the guy who invented the headlight for cars. So I'm sure you've seen headlights before. He was the first one to commercialize them and make money from them. He was also one of the first airplane makers. He was the first to cross the channel from France to Britain and on an airplane, and made some of the best early airplanes. So in this book, I imagine, hypothetically, that he set up this business where he wanted to commercialize airplanes. He wanted to make airplanes become commercial. And the way that he figured that out was to use them in a way that is commercial. But it was 1911, and it was still too expensive to move economic goods around and to move people around on airplanes. So what did he decide? The one thing that would probably be economical to move around would have to be something that is very heavy. Very light, very valuable, but not very heavy. So something that carries a lot of value per unit of weight. And what's the thing that carries the biggest value per unit of weight at that time? Gold. So he decides to set up a gold clearance system, a decentralized, peer-to-peer gold clearance system, which is named after him, Bleriot Transport Corporation, BTC. And so in 1911, we have an invention of something called BTC that allows banks to clear money between each other and not have to rely on central banks. And he sets that up in 1911, it does well, and then in 1914, World War I breaks out, and then when all the central banks start printing money, which is what happened in the real world, when they all start printing money and start getting into inflation, in the real world, they kept printing money for 4 or 5 years, and they destroyed their economies and destroyed their currencies eventually. But because we have the possibility of capital flight, where these airplanes are moving gold out of the country, because people just load them with gold and they don't have to read their banks, they don't have to use their banks, the central banks all go bankrupt. So we have in 1950 the collapse of all fiat money and all central banks, thanks to this wonderful invention, BTC. And so as a thought experiment for this book the thought experiment is, okay, we've done this, now what happens? What happens? Fiat money dies in 1915, no more central banks. The Federal Reserve goes out of business because it was lending to all of the central banks that were in war. So even though the US didn't get into war, the central bank is thankfully killed and destroyed in 1915. And then we have a whole century of peace and prosperity. So the value of money keeps going up because we don't have central banks. Sounds like a horrible thing if you've been to a university, but it's actually a good thing, because it's a good thing that things get cheaper. So prices just keep getting lower and lower, and that's a good thing, which means that things become more and more affordable. So in 1900, the average house in America cost about $3,000. Today, it is $420,000. So every year, on average, it has gone up at a 4% rate. So every year, houses in America have been getting 4% more expensive in the last 124 years, which is why you go from 3,000 to 420,000. Now imagine we stayed on the gold standard. Obviously, the house won't be $420,000. A house would have, I think, reasonably, you could say that since it's easier to make more houses than it is to make more gold, houses would get cheaper over time, right? Money increases in value in terms of houses. And so because of this, if we'd remained on the gold standard, you expect that the price of housing would decline something like 1%, 1.5% per year. And so today, the average house in America would be about $500. This is what the world could have been like, $500 to buy a house. Now, obviously, your salary would have been a little bit different, but a car, we could also think about that. Today, it could be very easy to imagine that a car would be worth $90. Of course, your salary would be different, but the salary would not decline as much as the price of these things decline, because it's easier to make cars and houses than it is to make human beings. Human beings are a lot more expensive. So labor, it's more difficult to make human beings than it is to make houses and cars. So labor doesn't decline in price as much. It's more difficult to make gold than it is to make human beings, so the price of gold goes up compared to human beings relatively. So your wages go down, but they don't go down that much because it's easier to make other things. So things get cheaper, your wages go down in nominal terms, but things get cheaper for you. So you can imagine in the year 1900, a wage was around $500. Today, it would be something like $150. Instead of being $60,000, would be $150. Now, if you think 60,000 sounds a lot more fun than 150, I'm sorry for all of the money you wasted on education. It was clearly a terrible waste, because it's not the total number of money that matters, it's the purchasing power. So a house, if your wage was $150, but a house was $500, it's a lot better than if your wage was $60,000 and the house was $420,000. So currently, in the year 1900, it took you about 6 years of work to earn with the average wage to build the average house, to be able to produce the average to be able to buy the average house. So you had to work for 6 years to buy a house. 120 years later, it takes you 7 years to buy a house, which is ridiculous because houses should be getting cheaper. Houses are not magic. It's very simple. You put a bunch of rocks on top of each other and you call an engineer and he fixes things. And so we have more engineers, we have more rocks, we have more machinery today than we had 100 years ago. We have all kinds of incredible sophisticated machinery produced to make this easier and cheaper. And it should be cheaper for us. And yet, it costs us more in our time today, which is much more productive, to buy a house. Why? It's because the value of houses goes up because people use houses as their bank account instead of using Bitcoin as their bank account. Instead of using money, instead of using hard money, good money, people buy houses as a saving account. So when you go and you try to buy a house for you and your family to live in, you're not just competing with people who are buying a house, you're competing with people who are looking for a saving account. Because they're buying that house because they think it's better than putting money in their saving account because their money is terrible. It's designed to decline. So in a world in which everybody has access to money, where they can just save in good money and not have to worry about the money losing value, how much house do you buy? You buy a house to live in. You don't buy a house as a saving account.
The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by thesafehouse.com, my independent publisher and bookshop, selling the best Bitcoin books in high-quality cloth hardcovers built to last for generations. Most books these days are pretty fiat. They're flimsy and they fall apart quickly, and I did not want that for my books, so I set up the Safe House especially to provide you with beautiful, long-lasting classic cloth hardcovers you can proudly pass down for generations. You can get copies of my 3 books, the Bitcoin Standard, the Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics, and you can also get copies of Lynn Alden's Broken Money, Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly, and Matthew Lysiak's Fiat Food, to which I contributed a few chapters. We now offer bulk discounts so you can buy books for yourself and for the friends and family you'd like to learn about Bitcoin. Buy any 2 books for $50, any 5 books or more for $20 per book, and for more than 50 books, it's only $15 per book. Go to thesafehouse.com, the SAIF house.com, where you can get all of these books in high-quality cloth hardcovers, delivered worldwide, and get 10% off for paying with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by the Daylight Computer. I love to work early in the morning and late at night, or in the sun outdoors, but regular computer screens are terrible at these times, and they strain your eyes. For years, I've wanted a paper-like electronic screen on a simple computer I could use to write. I tried several models, but none were very good. Now, finally, Daylight have delivered a fantastic full-function tablet with a paper-like screen that's easy on your eyes and great for outdoor use. I've been using the Daylight computer to write my next book, and it is absolutely fantastic, and it has led me to invest in this company myself. Check out my interview with Anjan Kata in episode 249.
So things get better in that world, and they get cheaper over time. And so therefore, we would live in a world today where it would take you 3.5 years. It would be cheaper, which would make sense. If we'd stayed on a gold standard, life would make sense. Houses today would be cheaper than they were 100 years ago. Because we have higher productivity today. We have amazing machinery today that we didn't have 100 years ago. We have computers and we have all kinds of amazing things. So therefore, it's cheaper for us to produce houses. This is what Fiat has taken from us. It has made houses more expensive. It's created a homeless crisis in many places because people use their houses as saving accounts and houses continue to get more expensive. And in that kind of world, houses would be continuously cheaper and people would be able to buy them using their own money. People would be able to put up real money and buy them because their savings appreciate over time. Your money would be getting more valuable over time. So people would start saving very young. They'd hold on to their savings until they can buy the large expenses that they want. And if it's only 3.5 years of work to save for a house, then pretty much everybody can begin working, stay with their parents, and then move away and buy a house. So imagine a world in which not everybody is a couple of paychecks away from becoming homeless. Sounds nice, right? Everybody in the modern world takes on a mortgage for their house. Not everybody, but most people take on mortgages because it makes sense. Why? Because you can't save money, because the money declines in value, and because interest rates and credit is subsidized because the government has a magic money printer, which gives you free money if you rent a house. So therefore, because of that, houses are constantly getting more expensive, and everybody is constantly taking on more debt. Take that away, what do you end up with? Something very different. You end up with a world in which major expenses are financed through savings. Savings appreciate over time, and because of that, everybody just holds a positive cash balance. Individuals, corporations, governments, everybody would just have a positive cash balance, whereas if you look today, everybody has a negative cash balance. Everybody's in debt. Everybody has debt, and everybody has to make payments on this debt, or else they lose their collateral. They lose very important things. That's a function of the fact that our money is constantly declining in value. Fix the money, and you fix that, and you have a hard money. So what would have happened to the 20th century if we'd spent the last 100 years accumulating savings? Well, some interesting patterns that I looked using this tool on Google called Ngram. Ngram is a fascinating tool because Google, as you may know, they indexed millions of books from all over the world. They scanned them and they indexed the data in them, and they scanned the letters and they converted it to text, and they did the analysis of that test. And one of the most interesting things they did was to try to find the prevalence of words, particular words, over time, to try and see how these words became more or less prevalent over time. So for me, it's interesting to look at 1915, because that was the year that the world went off the gold standard. Most people think 1971, but really it was 1915 when we went off the gold standard. So in 1915, if you look at that, there are things that didn't exist before then, and they existed after 1915. And I think the relationship is very clear of why it was fiat money that allowed those things to exist. And it's pretty incredible that when you look at these charts, you see that those things don't exist in the world where fiat, before fiat came. So therefore, if we didn't have those things over the last century, if we didn't have fiat money over the last century, we wouldn't have those things. We would not have this world out there. We would not have all of these things, bad things. Unemployment. The entire concept of unemployment didn't exist before fiat money. I know it sounds weird, but it's true. Before fiat money in 1914, 1915, as you can see in this chart over there, the left chart, fiat money, unemployment was a word that nobody used. As you can see in the chart, in the line, that shows there was no prevalence. Nobody used that word, unemployment. Being unemployed was not a thing that had a name for it. People just worked when they wanted to work and didn't work when they didn't want to work. This concept of people being involuntarily unemployed, or massive numbers of people losing their jobs at the same time because an entire sector of the economy has collapsed, this is a fiat phenomenon. This is only a result of the fact that governments and banks can print money. And when central banks stopped having the ability to print money, that concept wouldn't exist. If they did, it wouldn't exist. Another very important concept is inflation. Again, if you look at the pattern for inflation, you see before 1915, practically nobody spoke about the concept of inflation. Yes, there were occasions in which governments might abuse their money and print money, and then the value of money would drop, and people would talk a little bit about inflation, but only really started talking about inflation as a concept after World War I. That's when inflation was created. That's when the problem of inflation and the problem of unemployment really began to get created. And interestingly enough, also, Karl Marx, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but this guy, nobody really spoke about him before the 20th century. It was fiat money that created all of this leftism pandemic that has taken over the world. It really, before World War I, nobody took Marx seriously, and he was just another European weirdo who wrote weird things, and nobody really cared. But then, when the magic money printer became real, when these governments had these magic money printers, suddenly his ideas became extremely popular. And all of if you study the real history of what central banks did, you see that the Bolsheviks in Russia, the reason they came to power was because they were supported by German banks, and they were supported by American banks because they wanted to take out Russia. German banks wanted to take Russia out of the war. And so they supported the Bolsheviks. But if we get rid of the central banks, as we do in this story, which is great. The best thing about writing fiction is you can just get rid of things. You just get rid of them. So we get rid of the central banks in 1915. They stop financing the Bolsheviks in Russia. So we don't get Bolshevism, we don't get communism, we don't get all of this horrific chapter of humanity and all of the tens of millions of people that were killed with money printers, financed by money printers, with this horrific ideology of communism and socialism. All that doesn't happen if we don't have fiat money. So these are some of the ideas that I get in terms of politics and economics. But let's think about technological progress. What would technology look like in the 20th century if we hadn't moved from gold to horrific kinds of money? If we had stayed with good forms of money rather than going to terrible forms of money? Well, we see, if we look at what happened to energy consumption after 1970, when inflation really took off, we see that energy consumption declined. And in my book, Fiat Standard, I discuss why inflation leads to the destruction of energy. It leads to the destruction of the ability to invest long-term in energy production. And so as we see energy is becoming more expensive. We see, in real terms, in places like Germany and in Europe, energy today, electricity, is more expensive than what it was 20 years ago, which is really economic deterioration. It's economic decline. We're getting better. All of economic progress is about making energy cheaper and more affordable and more plentiful.
This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently.
We haven't had a century of inflation behind us. How much energy would we be consuming today? A lot more than we are currently consuming is my guess. So we would live in a world in which we're consuming a lot more energy. So what would that mean? I think it would be very easy to imagine that we live in a world in which the whole world gets 24/7 electricity. I think this is just entirely reasonable. If people have the ability to save, it's very straightforward to build electric generation plants and to build wires that connect to houses and give people electricity. The only reason we don't do it everywhere in the world, the only reason places in the world are unable to do it, is because they've been destroyed by inflation. If people could just store capital for a few years without having it robbed from them, they would be able to then accumulate capital and build power and have electricity. This is one very simple way in which the world would have happened. And I think we would have had a lot more nuclear weapons. I think that's very easy to imagine why that would take off. And we'd have a lot more transportation. We'd be spending a lot more energy on transportation. We'd have much higher level of technological advancement in transportation. Now in politics, think about what happens in the 20th century. Think about all the wars that were financed by central banks that printed money, and how this changed everything. And this is a point I discuss in the Bitcoin Standard and the Fiat Standard. Something fundamentally changed in the world in 1915 with World War I. Because before 1915, as a country, if you were a government and you wanted to fight a war, you had a bunch of gold, and you could spend that gold in order to fight that war. And when you ran out of that gold, that's it. Your war was done. You were no longer king. And that was it. And so kings had to be very careful. Now, 1914 comes along, and those central banks print money for fighting wars, and it works, and they continue to fight, and they continue to print money, and they've continued to print money since then. So they found that they can externalize the cost of mass murder and war to their people by increasing the money supply, which basically devalues the wealth that all of those people are holding. So when they discovered this, they've been robbing people and creating all of these wars. And this has given them an enormous amount of power over citizens, because they no longer need to go to people and ask for money. This is why war becomes a lot easier with fiat money. Under hard money, governments had to go door to door and ask people for taxes so that they could take that money and spend it on fighting war. But under a gold standard, but under a fiat standard where they can just print the money, people can keep their money. They don't have to pay their taxes. The government just prints money, and it takes the value that is stored in that money and uses it to finance itself. So because of that, we see why in the 20th century governments were so trigger happy. They were so happy to murder foreigners, murder their own local citizens, kill anybody, nuke countries. They've tried all kinds of crazy things because they didn't have to really pay for it. They weren't responsible adults handling a budget and thinking about how best can we grow the things that we manage. They had a magic printer that meant for them that there was no opportunity cost. So if we just don't like another country, we just print money and we destroy the value of money in our country in order to destroy another country, which is an insane thing to do, but you can do it when you have a money printer. Now take that away. What happens? We have a world in which governments need to run by financing themselves through taxation. Taxation is difficult to get. It's difficult to get people to give you money. And if you take too much of them, they start hiding from you. They start hiding the money. It becomes too expensive to get money from them. And there's a limit to how much you can get. So what we see is what we would see in that kind of world is the governments would be a lot more efficient, a lot more responsive to people, and they'd be a lot less despotic. And this entire notion that you want to take over foreign territories becomes a lot less attractive when you can't shill them a shitcoin. So one of the major attractions of conquering territory is that you take your shitcoin, your government's shitcoin, and you force the people in that territory to use it. And now millions of people who you conquered will have to use your money to store value. And now every time you create more of your shitcoin, you're robbing them of value. This is one of the main advantages of conquering countries. If you're conquering a country, this is really one of the top of the list. It's the easiest way to rob them because, otherwise robbing things actually and moving it is very complicated, particularly to a foreign country. So just give them money, print more of that money, and rob them. And then you can pay for the conquering of them. So you can pay for their conquering through printing the money. So it's a self-sustaining business model, which explains a lot about what we saw in the 20th century. Now take that away. What happens? Well, now you can't foist your shitcoin on these populations. So you can't pay for fighting them. So you have to pay for your own money. And then you have to run the country well enough so that you can pay for the conquering. So obviously that's just a non-starter as a business idea. Like anybody who tries this is going to fail. So who's going to succeed in running governments? People who can do sane things with government, which means not spend more than you earn, which means run things efficiently. And effectively what we would have is a world in which I imagine, in which people would freely choose to leave and exit governments and leave and exit regions, and governments will be powerless to stop them because governments are trying to convince them to please stay, please join us. So we'd have a world built much more on self-determination. Now what would that look like? I think what that would look like is a lot like the Gulf. I think the Gulf offers us an example of countries that really are a model of voluntary government and that people here choose to come here. The majority of the population in Gulf countries, in the Emirates and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, the majority of these countries, the majority of the population is foreign, which means all of those people chose to come and live here. And I think this is a factor in why this country has improved so much economically and the region in general, is because they've had to attract people from abroad. So they've always had to set up their institutions and their laws in a way that are attractive enough for foreigners to want to come here. I think we'd see this tried out much more extensively across the world in that people would want to work really hard, governments would want to work really hard to try and impress their citizens so that they would want to voluntarily pay taxes in those countries, so that they would want to live in that tax zone. So rather than fighting over territory, governments would compete with each other by offering better service. And this is, I think, an enormously revolutionary vision of what government is going to be in the future. And a great book that discusses it is a book by Prince Hans Adam II of Liechtenstein, the ruling Prince of Liechtenstein. He wrote a book called The State in the Third Millennium, which really was a big part of the inspiration behind thinking about this, where he says, and this is what they do in Liechtenstein, in that people have the right to self-determination. The people of Liechtenstein, all of them, they can choose to secede, leave the country, join Switzerland or join Austria. And essentially, it's a contract between the governed and the governor based on a specific tax rate and a specific set of rules, and at any point in time people are free to leave. I think this is what the world would look like if you take away the money printer from governments and you take away the special status that allows them to print money out of thin air. Then they just turn into another business operator, another service provider. And I think when you have this ability for the government to have the same power that a CEO has, and then it's satisfying and answering to customers, I think it's going to be a lot more efficient. Just ask yourself, why is your phone so good? Why is your iPhone so good? Is it because you wrote a letter to the CEO of Apple demanding that he install those features? Is it because you voted about which engineers in Apple are going to build things? Is it because you organized a political party within Apple to mobilize people to demand that they add touch screens or whatever? No, they added all of those things. Why? Because they want to sell the most. So because they're figuring out how to best meet the demand of the customer, they are incentivized to find the best answer to everything. And this is something that they're only incentivized to do because you don't have to buy Apple. You're not forced to be an Apple customer. If they don't build the thing that you like, you just move on and you use another company. But you can't do that with government when they have a money printer. You're forced and you're stuck with them. But when they don't have a money printer, then you have a lot more choice, because then all of these governments is just management companies, territorial management companies, and then the most efficient ones are going to attract most people. In the same way that people move today to the countries that are most efficient, like we see millions of people migrating to the Gulf, you would see this happening where people bring governments into their country and they move their country, they move their sovereignty more from one country to the other, because all of these management companies are governed by economic rationality. They must try to be better organized, and they realize that war is destructive. Unless you have a money printer where you can externalize the cost, war is very, very destructive. So we see a lot more self-determination. We'd see a lot more fiscal responsibility. You'd expect the world to look a lot more like Abu Dhabi, which I think is a nice thing. If you've gone around here, you know a lot of the world deserves to look like this, would benefit from looking a lot cleaner, more organized, safer, more peaceful. I think this is what happens when government is a lot more like a service provider. And I think, interestingly enough, if you think of a world like this, where we're constantly growing economically, because productivity is increasing, whereas on the other hand, governments don't have the ability to print money. Well, what does that mean? I think one massive thing about it is that there would be a lot less fake government jobs, which is, I think, an epidemic all over the world we see, particularly in governments that are not very efficient. They have an enormous number of people who don't actually work. And the reason they can get away with it, again, is because they have a money printer. So that happens in government, in the public sector, but it also happens in the private sector, in agencies and government and companies that are connected to the public sector, which get subsidized money. So what I imagine is, what happens if you put all of this fake work out of work? What happens to all of the people that have fake Fiat jobs, just writing reports and nobody reads every day? What happens when you can't pay all of those people because they don't have a magic money printer that buys their loyalty and votes? What do you have to do then? What are they going to do? I think what would have happened is we would have had a world of a lot more teachers. All of these people would be teaching children. And I think that would be really, really the measure of how humans progress. Because if you think about what works best for education, one of the most important things is having a large number of teachers per student, or a small number of students per teacher. That's really the most impactful thing you can do for education. And I imagine, as an economist, I always think of the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of this Fiat world, of all of these people that are working Fiat jobs, is that they're all having to work things that are not productive, but if they had to do productive things, they'd all be teaching. So we'd all have a lot more teachers, and students who go to school would be getting a lot fewer classmates, and so classes would be smaller and teaching would be a lot more productive. This is generally how I like to think of it. So these are the ideas of my next book, The Gold Standard. You can read the first 4 chapters of the book right now on my website, saifedean.com/TGS, The Gold Standard, and you can pre-order your copy right now for delivery in March. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming and appreciate your time. Thanks a lot. Cheers.